Hello, and welcome to Talking Insights, the podcast series from ESOMAR. I'm your host, Shrika Govindaraju, and throughout the series, we'll be taking a closer look at the key topics of today, taking a step beyond the world of market research and insights to tackle the big questions of our time. After all, our sector deals with understanding and predicting the world we live in. So let's look behind the numbers and dive into the most important conversations of today that will shape our tomorrow. The lockdowns imposed across the world to limit the spread of COVID-19 have undoubtedly helped in slowing the speed of the virus, but they have also had a profound effect on society and mental well-being. As innately social creatures, humans have long relied upon the security and predictability of the world around them to serve as a fixed anchor. But what happens when we remove the security of personal relationships and the social fabric that holds us together? As individuals across the world grapple with lockdowns and reopenings, what insights are we seeing about personal health and well-being under lockdown conditions? How have people been coping with isolation? What happens when our day-to-day life is turned upside down? And how will society look in the future as we emerge from these extraordinary times? Joining me today to discuss this fascinating period in human sociology and building on her recent series of articles for Research World is Dr. Meena Kaushik. Dr. Kaushik is the founder of Quantum Consumer Solutions, which he started in 1990 as the first soulless qualitative research company in Asia. Quantum has since expanded beyond the subcontinent to China and the UK, offering insighting, cultural and design ethnography, and design strategy to businesses across the world. Dr. Kaushik has adapted and applied to various schools of thought, such as social anthropology, linguistics, semiotics, and social psychology to the discipline, and earned her PhD from the Delhi School of Economics with a dissertation exploring the religious practices and symbolism that are the death rituals of Hindus. Dr. Kaushik, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you, Shrika. I'm delighted to be here.
So let's start where your article begins, which is looking at the conflict that has been created by social distancing between humanity's innate social nature and the externally enforced isolation that we are all living under. How do you think we're seeing this conflict manifest itself during the COVID pandemic?
So there are a number of manifestations of this COVID issue that we are seeing around us, and naturally, I'm not going to take you through all, but I'll comment on the more important ones. The first and the biggest manifestation that we are seeing across cultures is really a crisis of meaning. We're seeing a huge loss of meaning because, as you know, man is innately social and needs a lot of contact, intimacy, and belonging to feel that their world is in the right place. The moment this is taken away, suddenly the whole notion of order and meaning gets disturbed. And suddenly you have, through the COVID, a tremendous amount of focus on isolation, keeping your distance from one another, a lot of taboos, pertaining to contact and
can't shake hands anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And face-to-face interactions. Suddenly you're being told you have to wear a mask. You can't go out into the open. You've got to hunker down. And all this, in my opinion, is really symbolic of telling people rather, implicitly that your life is under threat and life is not normal, and suddenly things are out of control. So for the average human being, this is not the world that I think which is orderly, meaningful, steady and stable. This is anomie. This is chaos. This is a sense of being out of control, And the second big thing that we're noticing is that with this focus on social distancing, keeping your distance, worrying about contagion, we're seeing a certain divisiveness and a certain othering that is emerging in cultures, China bashing. Where did COVID come from? Must have come from the Chinese. Muslim bashing in India, saying, hey, they are the ones who go to the mosques and they pray and they're not following all the rules. You're seeing racial tensions in the US, where the blacks are being, beaten up. So something rather divisive is being given permission. And that permission comes from the fear of contagion, the fear that your life is under threat and somebody is responsible for this contagion. See, and it's
Mm-hmm.
always the the weaker sections of society. In India, for instance, if you look at our workforce, which is migrant in nature, it's a terrible condition that we are facing, because not only do they not have a home and a place in the cities anymore, but they're not being allowed to return to their rural homes. So they're
Yeah.
somewhere in between no man's land, hoping somehow that we'll get home. So we're seeing this as a terrible, terrible discourse. And the third very important manifestation is that with with absolute information overload,
Mm-hmm.
everybody has a point of view on how the COVID has to be managed. And what we're really seeing is the growth of a very fatalistic discourse. This is no longer just a virus. It's a deadly virus that's out to kill us. And
Mm-hmm.
normally, things get normalized in the human world either through the sacred canopy. So either, your religious thinking helps you find an answer to your problems, or the
Mm-hmm.
scientific discourse helps you find a solution to the problems. What's happened here is neither the religious nor the scientific canopy is able to reassure a man anymore. Suddenly, the medical sciences have thrown up their hands and said, we don't know anything about this virus. What we know will take some time. There is
Mm-hmm.
no vaccination against it. It's not like an influenza. It's something worse. So as a result, the the discourse is one of fertility. It's about, you're going to die. And the moment
Mm-hmm.
you move into that zone, moving from a normal anxious zone into one of complete paranoia. Yeah. So
Yeah.
and one last thing that I want to point out is that
Mm-hmm.
I feel that all this social distancing has also resulted in a lot of pressure on relationships. Now, on the one hand, I'm hearing people say, oh, what? I've really connected with my family again. And, it's so nice to be
Yeah.
at home and this is wonderful, etc. But I also see terrible fault lines developing. There's you're in cities where you're living in very small spaces. People don't have a space to be on their own.
Mm-hmm.
People don't have any safe space to go to where you can say, this is my space. So suddenly we're seeing an increase in domestic violence. We're seeing an increase in, discord. We're seeing an increase in divorces. So,
Yeah.
so
So it's not roses and sunshine for everyone who's been stuck at home with their family.
no. And we're also seeing a lot of people now, after about 6-7 weeks of, being locked down, saying, please, can I get back to work? I can't manage home, hearth, and work
Mm-hmm.
from a small room. So we're seeing a bit of that. So just to sum up, if I would say, I think humanity is moving from a zone of order and control to a zone of the unknown, which is
Mm-hmm.
threatening and life negating. It's characterized by paranoia and desperation and meaninglessness.
Well, you touched on a lot of things there, which I
Yeah,
think we definitely want to dive into more.
yeah,
I just
yeah,
want to quickly go back to the concept that you raised. So you mentioned this in your article, and
yeah,
you also mentioned it just now, this idea of nomos and the
yeah.
inverse, which is
Yes,
anomy.
yes,
So if you had to kind of summarize this concept of nomos for our listeners,
yes.
what would be the elevator pitch, let's say? When you say
Yeah.
nomos, what are we referring to?
So, nomos is derived from the Greek word, which means law and order. And the opposite of nomos is chaos. So
Mm-hmm.
when, man classifies, when I can put things into place, when I can give them I can categorize them, then I'm safe. I know what they mean in my life, so there's a
Mm-hmm.
role, there is a place, there is a position in my world, right? And that's what gives meaning. Now, the moment something attacks this meaning system, and to give you one example is death. Death
Mm-hmm.
always poses an issue of meaning. Suddenly,
Yeah.
I ask myself the question, So what is this? Why me? How do I deal with this loss? What is this world all about? Suddenly, a lot of transcendental questions will come up in the face of death. And COVID is very close to that. So it is actually posing a threat to everything that I think is orderly, in place, normal, stable. It's like death. It's suddenly putting my world upside down and making me ask questions which I was, asleep about all this while. Because when you're alive and you're affirming life, you're not really asking yourself, if I told you that you could die, you're definitely going to die tomorrow, I think you would have a completely different perspective about your life.
I think you might panic a little bit. Yeah.
So the beauty of it is that nature and culture don't allow us to think about our death too significantly, because if they did, there would be no continuity.
I find that interesting. You mentioned, just going back to the information about your PhD studies, where you looked into, Hindu death rituals. As a Hindu myself, I was always brought up with the belief that, there's reincarnation and the soul lives on in a new form. Do you think the studies that you conduct at university, looking at this concept of death, how does that relate to how you see people relating to it today during COVID? Because, as you mentioned before, we have this constant influx of information, and one of the pieces of information we've been seeing the most of is the death toll. Sadly, it's across the world. It's the numbers that are presented to us, and personally, I find that it's quite dehumanizing. It becomes a statistic.
Yes.
So, how do you think this information that we've been receiving gels with this concept that as humans we find it quite difficult to think about the concept of death in everyday life?
I think it whips up a huge anxiety. To be quite honest, the truth of it is that nobody wants to die. I mean, I've been observing people in our communities, when I meet older people. I'm pretty old myself. I'm 68, and I'm in the vulnerable group. And the conversation I hear, nobody says, hey, you know what? I've lived a good life. Time to go. And it's okay, Shakespeare in Julius Caesar, there's this lovely quote that, the valiant dies but once, the coward dies many a death. So we're all cowards. We die many times in our lifetime. None of us are able to really face it and say, it's okay if I die. So what I find is, as we keep pumping figures, and as we keep giving a pessimistic view of how things are going, I find that what is normal as anxiety. See, being anxious is not a bad thing, but being paranoid is, and we're moving towards paranoia and not towards normal anxiety. So nobody wants to die. Everybody is out to protect their lives. Like, so-and-so, don't come near me if I think you might give it to me.
But I find this also links back to nomos, as we mentioned before.
Yes.
One of the things I came across in my own studies, and funnily enough, in a very unrelated field, which is organizational crime, looking at corporate criminality, is the concept of anomie, which is from Emile Durkheim. So the idea that society provides little moral guidance to individuals. So do you think during this crisis we've actually moved from a position of nomos, as it breaks down, to this position of anomie?
Oh, absolutely. We are in a state of anomie. And anomie is liminal. See, it immediately puts you in a betwixt state. You're not in order. You're not in something stable. You're between something stable and completely, chaotic. So where should I be? And of course there will be tremendous efforts on the part of cultures to somehow normalize this situation. So all that is happening simultaneously. there's a transcendental part of us also. There's a spiritual part of us. There's an introspection that's also going on simultaneously. There's also immunologists talking about how, this is here to stay. It's nothing to be worried about. So there are attempts at normalizing it, but for the average human being, we're in a state of anomie.
Mm-hmm. And I think this also, going back to your education, so as a social anthropologist and with the research that you've carried out, and of course with the work that you've done with Quantum CS as well, looking at this concept of society and how we cope with these times of crisis, do you see, over the course of your career or over the course of history, the way that our society has evolved, has this helped or has it hindered our ability to cope with this loss of nomos and this move towards anomie?
Yeah, let me just say that there is no black and white answer on how societies have actually, the evolution of society, whether it's helped or it doesn't help. To be quite, for instance, I've noticed that the more collective societies tend to be much more receptive to receiving injunctions about how we should live for the common good, right? But if you look at the slightly more individualistic societies like the US, where the individual is primary.
It's the American dream, yes.
Yes, exactly. There's a tremendous need for personal liberty and and control and wanting to make the decisions and being, in the know. So we find that the individualistic societies are more conflicted about how things are being put into place. Collective societies tend to be a little more receptive. But then there's another, paradigm that comes into play. Whether you have an authoritarian political system or you have a more liberal political system. Now, where the political system is authoritarian, it's very paternalistic. It's making the decisions for you and people are towing the line, but there is a complete loss of personal liberty there. Right? So there's no question. You may have apps that tell you what's happening all around you and who's infected and who's not infected. But it's also, this data is also taking away everything that's private and personal to you. You see? And you're being controlled. You're part of a large AI matrix. So there's a worry there too. Liberal political systems have a much harder task because you've got many voices in that system jockeying for different needs. They have different needs. They're asking for different things. So how do you have this one umbrella set of rules that you will, get people to follow? So it's not an easy task for politicians. I would say this is perhaps their worst year.
Without question, I think.
Yes.
We're only 6 months in the year as well, so touch wood that this is as bad as it gets.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, go on.
No. So I was just going to say that the only hope and one can have is that there is something about the human spirit which has always surprised us when we think it's, soared right to the bottom of the pit. It also has that ability to soar right into the sky, and we can't say whether the human collective will remain at the level of nativism and parochialism and divisiveness, or whether it will soar into something which is collective and responsible and, with purpose and with, for the collective good. So I don't know which way it's going to go. But culturally, there is always a revival. Toynbee, the great historian, used to say that there's his concept of challenge and response. He said cultures which get destroyed or decimated because of some cataclysmic event very often rebuild themselves with a fervor that is incredible, like Japan after it was, after the atomic bombing. it
Hmm.
re-emerged as a huge innovation center and, industrial power and or what have you. So the world being decimated by this, we have the chance of coming up with a new force, a new imagination, a new thinking. So I really don't know which way we'll go, whether we will just slip back into our, old ways, or we will
Hmm.
really consider that we have a chance to do it again.
So I have to say, I agree entirely based on the information that we've been seeing during this COVID outbreak. You have, as you mentioned, there's in some ways this fragmentation of the sense of society and community that is brought on by the lockdown. And on the other hand, you see inspiring stories from across the world of communities coming together
Oh,
to
yes, and
support
absolutely.
each other. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And at the same time, speaking of technology as well, it's an interesting role because it has been a support for a lot of people in dealing with social isolation. I mean, for myself, I've been working from home for the past 3 months here in the Netherlands, and without technology, that wouldn't be possible. And it's a means of staying in contact not only for your work but also just keeping in touch with your friends. I've been speaking to them more than ever actually during this time. And do you see? But you also mentioned before yourself that technology can have these more invasive uses through, depending
Yeah.
on the nature of your government. Do you see technology providing a solution, or is it still very much a gray area where it can really go either way?
Uh, I agree with you, Shrikar. I think technology plays a huge role. It's been extremely empowering. And on the positive side, it has connected us to others, to the world at large. It has given us the ability to work from home. And amazingly, technology has innovated speedily to actually build in a vast number of human-like qualities like empathy, personalization, joyousness. So, you have apps that allow you to party. You have apps
Mhm.
that allow you to go and visit a museum. You have apps which allow you to, shop online and so on and so forth. So AI has really, really gone places. And in my opinion, this is not going to go away, because I'll tell you why it won't go away. Because once you've tasted blood, you don't, you're a man eater. So this is our
Yeah.
this is our new addiction. This is our new narcotic for the future. But fortunately, I have to, I need to balance this argument with another side, which is that having said this, I want to say that both nature and our psyche have a transcendental quality.
Mhm.
And despite the fact that we are so into technology, there are some needs that technology just cannot fulfill.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so, to give you an example, just the awe of sitting under a star-studded sky, watching a glorious sunset,
Mhm.
scaling a mountain, going for a trek or a hike, watching a baby being born, just hugging your grandchildren or your loved ones, or drinking a glass of beer with your friends,
Yeah. Mhm.
not virtually, but, and actually demonstrating and expressing love, which is more physical and more, tangible and tactile. That unfortunately, no matter what you may say, technology will not be able to replicate, and thank God for that. So you may have your little huggy toys from Japan, and you may have apps. I remember a film many, many years ago made by Woody Allen called The Sleeper. I don't know if maybe you were just not even born when it was
It
released,
might have been a bit before my time. Yeah.
where he portrays a society in the future where everything is AI driven.
Mhm.
And he, of course, this poor soul belongs to a, historic culture where, sex is not easily available if you're ugly. And,
Mhm.
so he wakes up in this society where people don't have physical sex. You have an orgasmatron. You walk into this machine and life seems so great, but it isn't actually. So, there are dysfunctionalities there. So thank God for that. I think AI will have its place and role. And I think it's a huge role, and it's a role to be appreciated and celebrated. But it's going to be balanced by other needs, which nature and the psyche will continue to dominate and ask for.
So in your view, technology is more of this extension of our reach into the world as opposed to a replacement for it.
Oh, yeah.
Something that can enhance or maybe broaden our scope, because ultimately I think without technology, without things like, we all have computers in the palm of our hands today, which even 20, 25 years ago would have been unthinkable.
Correct.
And the amount of information that flows through them does bring us closer to the outside world. But I think quite rightly, as you say, it is no replacement for those tangible physical experiences.
I remember as much as 40 years ago, I met a scientist from Princeton who was telling me about how in the future there will be AI technology where through a hologram, I will be able to moderate consumer groups without being there. This is going to be a reality. We are already doing everything online, and including culture work, which is ethnography, where you're really observing consumer in situ in their homes and doing things. It is happening through a digital format. So this is a new reality. But will it ever replace or fully replace, or will I may not. I mean, I'd like to believe that there will still be the value for, the human face-to-face contact.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned research there, and of course the work that you're doing moving online, because I think for a lot of our listeners, for a lot of ESOMAR members, of course, moving research online has been a very rapid transition over the past few months. And from the work you've been doing, or from the insights that you have, do you see research that is conducted in this way having the same impact, the same level of insight as you would get from interviewing someone face-to-face? Or are there limitations to technology that we're now discovering as our reliance on it grows more and more?
I think digital work can be, depending on how you do it and the sources you use, can be terribly insightful too. So I wouldn't diss it. I would say that a lot of work and there's a lot of data available, but making sense still requires the human brain and mind. And I don't believe that AI algorithms can ever replace the insightful human mind, because our insights don't really come from the brain. They come from somewhere higher. They come from from tools of perceptions that are really inside you. They're really, they're more spiritual than, logical or rational. Yeah. So that bit, sense making, can never be replaced by AI. That's my belief. I think
absolutely. And it's interesting then that you mentioned this higher sense or this higher understanding, because one of the things I really took away from your articles that you wrote for Research World is this idea of coping with the lockdown, coping with this COVID crisis by searching for a higher purpose. I believe that's the phrase that you used.
Yes.
What do you mean, precisely by a higher purpose? And if it's not too personal a question, which higher purpose have you been finding over the course of the past few months?
If we look at our the way we've evolved as a human species, I think you'd agree with me if I say there's nothing much to celebrate about what we have achieved and what we have done. You see, because on the one hand, I know we've made huge progress in terms of industrialization and, technology and science and landing, rockets on the moon and so on and so forth. But at another level, I think we are a species that has been particularly destructive.
Yeah.
For one, we're terribly selfish. We don't think we share this universe with other living beings, whether they are the plants or the animal life, or we think everything is us and we
Mm-hmm.
dominate this planet. So that's one thing. So we're really we are into consumption, we're into destruction, and we're into power and control. The higher purpose really comes from seeing this from a place where it's not about need and greed. It's about reciprocity. What is it
Mm-hmm.
that I take and what is it that I give back? And should I be taking more than what I give back, or should I be giving more than what I take? And if we look at the history of capitalism, it has been extremely powerful, but it's also been terribly irresponsible. So there is a need for a purpose-driven capitalism. There is a need for tempering this absolutely, no holds barred pursuit of money and growth, and the rat race. And I feel that even parenting has skewed itself to the point where we have brought up our children to believe that there is no other way in life other than the rat race. There's no other way of being. You're not a success unless you are successful in the rat race. But I do have great hopes from the millennials, from the Generation Z. I think there is a new awakening there. I think the older generations perhaps were too socialized, were too fossilized, were too controlled by our social conditioning to perhaps change. Maybe it's a little late for us. But I'm seeing a different sense. I get a different sense when I speak to the younger generations. So there is hope for us. There's optimism.
I'm glad people of my age can give you hope as well as
yes, they do.
I think most of the time we give the old generation headaches more than any sense of hope. I do want to. What you mentioned there was very interesting in terms of the younger generation adopting this new attitude, this new mindset. This links, of course, to, as you mentioned, this kind of rampant consumerism that has built up over the past 50, 60 years, how long it's been. And there's new movements towards, obviously environmental protection, towards social cohesion. Corporate social responsibility has become a school of thought in its own right. Do you think these movements, there is energy behind them to keep moving? Or, as we've seen during the crisis, as past, there has been even things that you'd think are obvious transitions have seen pushback, have seen a reluctance to move forwards.
Yeah.
So how can we overcome that as we go on over the course of this year and looking beyond as well?
So Shrika, let's take an example of climate change. And you know how long this has taken for people and countries to wake up to how important this is. But the interesting thing that the COVID has done through this lockdown is actually shown people what being off the roads, being hunkered down, being not allowed to consume, being not allowed to produce has done for the environment. And the proof of the pudding is really in seeing this. So, you have, I think social media is flooded with videos of animals roaming freely on the streets, rivers getting cleaned up, sighting
the picture of the New Delhi skyline. You could finally see the Himalayas again from New Delhi for the first time in God knows how long.
Yes. So I think at least this is going to get people to think. Whether we're going to have a very short memory and we're going to forget it very quickly because, we want to just go back to saying, oh, thank God I'm alive and thank God I can consume. That's possible. But I do believe that there is going to be some reevaluation, because this has been quite a paradigm. It's been cataclysmic. So the change that will come about is not going to be an evolutionary change. It's going to be a paradigm shift. So this new paradigm, I believe, there are opportunities there for us to do things differently. So I think there might be a greater consciousness about climate. There's going to be a greater consciousness about consumption. A lot of people I meet tell me, suddenly I've discovered that I don't need so many things. I have suddenly discovered I don't need to travel so much. I've suddenly discovered I don't need as many services that I depended on. I've suddenly discovered that I don't need such an elaborate menu. I don't need to eat out so often, so on and so forth. So if this remains and this becomes a new consciousness, and we develop a conscience as a result of this, I think very wonderful things might emerge as a result of this.
I think one of the examples, just thinking in terms of current events as well, of the social consciousness is going back to the start when you mentioned, the protests that have emerged around the world, arguing for, racial equality, for changes to these.
And how.
Absolutely. And this, interesting enough, I think it ties back to the concept of nomos, because, this idea of social order and structure, in a way, these protests are arguing to upend that current system of nomos and replace it with a new one.
Correct.
Not necessarily to just descend into anomie. So how do you see, is this leading to more anxiety? Because it seems people are becoming more comfortable coping with this idea that maybe sometimes you do need to upend your social order for real change to take place.
So I think this is a very good way to normalize. When you have something bigger and higher, it's a goal which is less selfish and it's less me, and you've got something bigger to concentrate and focus on. I think it leads to normalization and creation of nomos more speedily. So I think this is a good thing. These are the emergence of all these protests, and is an indication that people are seeking a new imagination or a new world order.
Well, to bring it, speaking of people, the individual, to bring this, I feel our conversation has been very high level on like a global scale. To bring it back down to something more personal, as you mentioned, this has been a time of tremendous anxiety and of worry regarding factors which are arguably much, much larger than ourselves as individuals. What advice would you give, having looked into these phenomena, having looked into society's reaction to individuals who are trying to make their way through this period of time? How can we maybe find a better sense of self or well-being, mental health? What advice would you have to people who are struggling with this?
So, here I'd really like to recognize and give credit to Luana Marquez, who's a CBT practitioner in Harvard, and who I've had the good fortune of meeting and, working with her and, reading some of the stuff that she, publishes. And I find that it is extremely sensible and extremely practical what she suggests. For one thing, CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy, tells you that anxiety is not a bad thing. It's really an impetus for the human organism to act, to protect itself, to be motivated, to achieve. But when anxiety is pushed into the zone of, where you think you can't control it, that's when it becomes phobia or paranoia or mental disorder or instability. And the only way to deal with it is to first understand what this virus is all about. So do a filtering of the information that you're getting sensibly. Do not move. There's going to be always the one who tells you there's doomsday. And then there's the other side which tells you, hey, nothing has changed. Both are incorrect. Have a balanced view of how you can protect yourself without becoming OCD on the one hand, or becoming paranoid, or becoming or start othering others. So a balance is required. And it's very important not to allow this absolute addiction to everything that's coming on social media. Learn to switch off. I think it's terribly important. We need to actually say, hey, you know what? I don't need all this information. Thank you very much. I've got to structure my life. I've got to pretend as if, even if I'm working from home, I've got to do hundreds of things that I wanted to do. May I do them now? If it's your gardening, or it's your work, or it's cooking, or it's art, or it's whatever it be, do something which keeps your cognitive brain ticking and your limbic brain asleep. Otherwise, you're going to be panicking. So the panic mindset is going to be a big one. If you're just absorbing information and you're not dealing with it. Yeah. So that's a critical thing. And the third thing is that we are not going to turn this into a fatal discourse. This is not about death. This is about a normal amount of dying that happens regardless. Old people will die. People with influenza do die. People with, floods do die. Earthquakes die. I mean, certainly this is bigger, and we're going to have to live with it. We're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to face it, and we're going to have to normalize it. And unless we do that, our brains are going to be super overheated with anxiety.
Yeah, I completely agree with the last point as well. I feel one of the major kind of shocks to myself personally dealing with this is when we normally see these large-scale disasters, be it an earthquake or a volcano, it's localized. It's very localized to one particular part of the world. There is this remoteness to the event where we can watch it on the news, and you feel the sense of empathy, you feel a sense of sadness, but ultimately you do know, it's far enough away from me that I'm okay. Whereas the difference I feel that has really happened with COVID and arguably previous pandemics, although not on this scale, is that the danger that was once far away, you first see it on the news and it says it's in China, then it moves across Asia, and eventually it's on your doorstep.
Yeah.
And I think that completely changes the way that you see this, right?
Absolutely. And there are two things here. One is that it's captured the whole world. The other is it shows no signs of abating. Third, there are too many pessimists who tell us that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Fourth, the lockdown doesn't help. See, because it has an emotional aspect to it. I feel that I'm locked down. So it's humanity is in lockdown and death roams free. That's what's happening.
It's almost apocalyptic in kind of when you put it in those terms, it really feels, very Book of Revelations.
Right, exactly. Biblical, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it's speaking of lockdown as well, being in this situation for so long. I myself, I've been working from home for the past 3 months. And you mentioned before that you find these outlets to maybe it's a means of channeling some of this anxiety or filling the time that you would otherwise spend doing something outside. And I think everyone has been finding their little niche. I myself have turned into a bit of a compulsive baker over the past few months. So I wanted to ask you, how have you been? Have you found your activity or your outlet that you'd like to share?
Yeah, certainly I'd love to share. For one, I believe that meditation plays a huge role in actually calming all your nerves, and it also gives you a wonderful space to introspect about your life and, where you want to go and what the journey has been all about, and insights about yourself. And so that's one thing that earlier in all this running around, one used to say, yes, I'll do it, but I never had the time. But now, one does it and one sees and one has reaped the benefits of that. The other thing that I find extremely valuable is that stop focusing on yourself and focus on others. Despite the fact that I'm locked down, I'm trying whatever I can in terms of linking up with communities that are helping, the homeless, stray dogs and cats, people who are suffering from hunger, people who are unemployed and cannot make ends meet. It helps. It helps to be able to do whatever you can do. And I write sometimes against social injustice. I contribute all my salary in the last 4 months towards feeding people who don't have food. I've just decided, well, you know what? I can survive. So it's okay. There's time to make money and there's time to give it. So though I'm not able to go out, which I would love to do, which is, get out on the street and actually, in India, there are 2 or 3 some amazing movements which I'd like to share with the world.
Absolutely.
One is that housewives in cities have started cooking bread, rotis, and it's called the Circle of Love. So there are young people who collect these from various homes and then feed the migrant populations that are stranded in spaces. And this is happening in cities like Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, and it's an amazing movement. So while one is being able to do this, one is also contributing funds while the younger people are running around and actually making it happen, So there's lots that can be done. And in Buddhism, they say that happiness comes when you stop thinking about yourself, but you think about others and others' happiness. So I think the time has come for us to just not be so self-focused. Look, we are all going to die eventually. Can we just make it meaningful?
I would just like not to think about it, I think.
Yeah. No, don't escape, Rika.
I want to reassure anyone who's listening that the podcast is normally not this depressing. We like to keep things light. On a side note, I'd like to, you mentioned India, and of course you're based in India. India, of course, it's where I'm from originally. I've visited many times. And I feel it's a fascinating case study almost of all of these things that we've been discussing up until now. So this idea of societal order, which is very important in India, technology, which has absolutely exploded over the past decade, past 15 years. And linking back to your university studies as well, your research into customs and rituals and traditions from your vantage point where you are. And of course, in your job as a researcher as well. Can you tell us a bit about India? How is it looking today? How is it developing? Because I try to keep up to date. I read some things, but really, what is the boots on the ground perspective of how all of these global transitions are really shaping the country?
So, we're seeing a huge and cataclysmic shift, not just through the COVID. I think India went through a period of globalization where it was different. And today we're seeing a growth of a new Indian identity, which is really based in a very local, parochial narrative. And that's very worrying. As a social anthropologist, I worry about what this means for the fabric of society. Because, what began as a strong Hindu movement has led to the othering of smaller and other religions on the one hand. And, India has always been a highly inclusive and unified, religiously unified culture.
Yeah.
We're not seeing that anymore. We're seeing a lot of separation. And while you can unify under Hinduism, let me tell you that very soon this is going to lead to parochialism and regionalism. It's going to be the South versus the North, the East versus the West. It's going to be, my city, my village, so where does this stop?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just hope that something will happen which will change this. But we are seeing this. And this is a worrying trend. And as we lose economic momentum, because, all countries are going to come out of this weaker economically. So there's going to be unemployment, there's going to be drop in per capita income, there's going to be huge, no capital formation, etc., etc. But this is going to further exacerbate the fault lines that are forming, because suddenly everything is scarce. So what does this mean? Are we going to have wars over food? Are we going to have wars over, who owns what? I don't know. It's troubling.
No, and I feel as someone who I have a real interest in history, and over the past couple of years, I've been reading a lot about Indian history in particular, and learning a lot of things that were never told to me or weren't made apparent, such as the sheer influence of the Mughal Empire on India when it was an invasion at first, but it was an assimilation after that. And there's been a rewriting of history almost in some sense, where that influence has been downplayed to something that makes them seem more like a kind of passing effect rather than a long-term contributor to the structure of the country. And I really feel this is a conversation that's happening across the world. To go back to the protests we were speaking of before, one of the responses, of course, has been to bring down statues of controversial historical figures, of those who were slave owners, but who may have contributed to their cities. Do you think, and this is with your social anthropologist hat on, not as a researcher, how is this revisionism of history, whether it's in India, whether it's in the US or the UK, how will this impact us going forward? Because personally, I think there's a lot to learn from the past to tell us where to go in the future. What happens when we start rewriting the past? What happens when we start selectively altering where we've come from?
I think it's terrible. I think when you don't have a sense of history and you rewrite it to suit the dominant community, you're in trouble, because you're absolutely right. Our past informs our present, and it gives us a dimension and perspective of our future and what it can be. You're creating huge fracturing of what we are all about, and this worries me, because we're seeing this across the world. We're seeing the emergence of, highly dictatorial styles of leadership, which are extremely revisionist in their thinking. And it's shocking that there are large chunks of population who really, support this and adulate a leader of this nature. But perhaps this has also come from, maybe this is a response to the fact that with globalization, there was too much porosity of borders and of, the flow of information and the flow of capital and the flow of, people. If you read Apadarai, you see many things flowing across the world. I'm wondering whether that led to a certain kind of threatening of self, which is therefore, I'm no longer significant because you know what? The Chinese are taking over. Or I'm not significant because you know what? Some Asian is moving into my job, or so on and so forth. So I'm not sure whether this is also something as a retaliation to what we saw as a great opening up of the world.
Yeah.
We're also seeing a sort of involution happening. But I'm hoping that, like all cycles of history, we will see a resurgence of a slightly more sensible, sustainable, liberal mindset coming back. Not this. Unless there are enough people who say democracy is dead and liberalism is dead, and I don't know.
The naysayers, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think there's a beautiful parallel between the cycles of history you describe and going back to your research into Hinduism, the cycles of time described by the Hindu religion. And let's on a positive note, if there's one good thing that you're going to take away from the past few months, from everything that's been going on, what is the one thing that gives you the most hope for the world? Looking forwards.
I think it's the young people who have not been, who are voicing a protest against the politics of hate. the politics of discrimination, the politics of, revisionism, so to say. We're seeing lots of movements of this kind happening in various parts of the world, and I hope this coalesces into a very big movement, because that is where the world needs to go.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Dr. Kaushik, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your insights on what is one of the most fascinating moments in recent history. And thank you, of course, to all of our listeners who've been joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion, hopefully learned something new, and look forward to welcoming you all again next time. If you enjoy the show, please follow us on SoundCloud or Spotify or via Research World, where you can also enjoy Dr. Kaushik's articles. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and most of all, stay curious. Dr. Kaushik, thank you very much once again. Thank you all and goodbye.